The Holy Gospel is written in the 17th chapter according to St. Matthew.
Glory to you, O Lord.
6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became bright as light. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will set up 3 tents here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my Son, the Beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." And when they raised their eyes, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." Here ends the reading of the Holy Gospel, the word of the Lord. Well, what a day, the day of transfiguration. And so we celebrate this, and Jesus being transfigured or transformed, as it were, on a mountain. There's some discussion about what mountain it was. There is one called Hermon that is very, very tall and has a lot of clouds around it, and often you can see storms in it. And it is thought that that is more likely where Jesus went, was up Mount Hermon. But it's not critical to know which mountain he went up or even part way, but that he did, and he was transfigured. And on this Sunday, this is before Lent begins with Ash Wednesday of this week, and we put away our Alleluias. And so we put away our This is the Feast and those hymns and liturgy that we might sing that have Alleluia in them for the next 40 days. It's a bit of a somber time and a time to be reflective. But until then, we're going to rejoice in the Transfiguration. Ruth Ann Reese, Chair of Biblical Studies at Ashbury Seminary in Kentucky, shares this with us. The narrative about Christ's transfiguration is not just a story that Peter and the apostles made up to manipulate potential converts. Instead, they are sharing an eyewitness account of a supernatural experience that transformed their understanding of Jesus. He was not just a Messiah, but he was also the Son of God, who embodied the glory of God. Now, both Peter's eyewitness account and the work of the Holy Spirit through the prophets are support for the reliability of Peter's testimony about Jesus. He who was transfigured is able to transform. He who was spoken of through prophecy calls his people to the kingdom. Now, there are a few bits and pieces from Duncan with some of my own thoughts involved in the next portion of this message. The spellbound disciples looked on in disbelief as they saw Jesus talking with Moses and Elijah. Caught up in the emotion of the moment, Peter wanted to prolong the experience as long as possible. So it's quite likely that that's why he proposed to build a dwelling place, one for Moses, one for Elijah, and one for Jesus. Who could blame him? This was a really high point in his religious experience. Now, haven't you all, at some time or other, had an experience that was just over the top? You felt great, exhilarated, and you wanted that feeling to last forever. Anyone who has ever been on a religious mountaintop can certainly sympathize with Peter. Now and here's a little story, after Kathleen accepted Jesus Christ into her life, it seemed like the whole world changed. Store clerks became nicer. She wrote, "The sun shone brighter, birds chirped more cheerfully, and flowers bloomed more beautifully." Of course, I thought the world had changed, she recalled. I didn't realize until a few years later that it was I who had been changing. I was different. I had softened. It wasn't the store clerks who had become friendlier, but I had. Now, each of us could have that kind of mountaintop faith, and sometimes we do. How sad to see a Christian who has lost the joy of his or her salvation. But it was never meant for us to always stay on the mountaintop, because as we know all too well, sometimes we meet God in the valley. Presbyterian pastor and writer Frederick Buechner recalled a low time in his life when God broke through in a very unusual way. "I remember sitting parked by the roadside once," Buechner writes, "terribly depressed and afraid about my daughter's illness and what was going on in our family. As he was sitting there thinking about his daughter's illness, he noticed a car that just sort of seemed to appear out of nowhere. His message from God, the word he most needed to see at that moment, was found on the license plate of this passing car. The license plate bore on it the one word out of all the words in the dictionary that I needed most to see exactly at that moment in time." Buechner wrote, "The word was trust." Anyone who has ever met God in a valley knows how precious that experience is. The important point is that we should not feel guilty if we are going through a period of life when there are a lot more valleys than mountaintops. Now, there are some believers who have the mistaken notion that a perpetual smile is a sign of authentic faith. That's not true. The joy of the Christian is an inner assurance that wears well both on the mountaintop and in the valley. As the lady said to Peter Jenkins, the Christian walk is a faith, not a feeling. It is an eternal, fundamental truth, not simply a glib testimony. The God of the mountaintop is also the God of the valley. What matters is the change that takes place in our lives. What matters is not a feeling, but a faith. Now, this morning, as I've mentioned, is a very special Sunday in the life of the Christian church. It's Transfiguration Sunday, a day when God gives 3 of Jesus' disciples, Peter, James, and John, sort of a peek at the end of the story. In this mountaintop moment, these disciples get a glimpse of Jesus' true identity and true mission. They fell down in fear. Jesus came and touched them. Can't you just see, with all of this brightness going on and Moses and Elijah showing up, they fall to the ground. And Jesus simply comes over, lays his hand on their shoulder or on their head, and says, "Get up. Don't be afraid." When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, this was really important, don't tell anyone what you have seen until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. Now, can you imagine Peter, James, and John about that time? They're wondering what's going on. What does Jesus mean? Well, there it is. Peter, James, and John get a peek at the end of the story. In this man, in this moment, on this mountain, God's ultimate plan for humanity is revealed just for a moment. The whole of human history is pointing in a certain direction. And in the transfiguration, we get to see what that direction is. In this moment, the disciples see who Christ really is. On that mountaintop, the disciples began to understand that Jesus isn't simply a man who has been touched by the glory of God. He is God in human flesh, and he's been hiding his glory from human eyes until now. He isn't just sent from God. He is God, come to earth to redeem his people. Little story. There's an interesting figure in Mexico named Father Sergio Benitez. Father Benitez was known as a very caring priest who operated a small orphanage in Mexico. At least that was his identity in the daytime, but by night, the good father was somebody else altogether. Unknown to his flock, Father Benitez at night would put on a showy mask and a cape and transform himself into a professional wrestler named Fray Tormenta, or Friar Storm. Now, you might have heard his story. His life is the basis for the movie Nacho Libre. For almost 23 years, Father Benitez hid his identity from his fans. He only began wrestling to earn prize money just to keep the orphanage running. Eventually, another wrestler discovered Father Benitez's secret and his true identity, and he told on him. By then, Father Benitez was ready to retire from the ring anyway, so not a real big deal. Many of the former orphans under Father Benitez's care went on to incredible, productive, successful lives. Now, one of those former orphans is now a criminal law specialist in the city of Hidalgo, Mexico. Now, that's his identity in the daytime. But at night, he transforms himself into a masked wrestler by the name of Fray Tormenta Jr., in honor of the priest who fought on his behalf. In this moment, on the mountain, Peter and James and John get a peek at Jesus' true identity. In this moment, we get to see Jesus' mission fulfilled. Why would Moses and Elijah be talking to Jesus about his death? Because Jesus' death and his resurrection would complete the ministries of Moses and Elijah that they had begun more than 1,500 years earlier. Through Moses, God gave the law that would define God's relationship with the nation of Israel. And yet the law was also a symbol of our failure and the Jews' failure to live up to God's holiness. Elijah represented the greatest prophet to the nation of Israel. And yet the prophets failed too. Now God himself, God's self, has come in the form of Jesus to fulfill the mission of the law and the prophets, to call people back to a true relationship with God. One last little story. In 2008, two college women's softball teams, the Western Oregon Wolves and the Central Washington University Wildcats, faced each other for a final game. Sarah Tucholsky played for Oregon. She was not really one of their strongest players, but by golly, she hit a home run. She accidentally, though, missed first base. She turned back to touch base, and when she did so, she tore her ACL. An excruciating injury. She wouldn't be able to complete her home run, the only one that she ever had hit. Her teammates couldn't help her either without forfeiting the game. But Mallory Holtman, who played for the opposing team, jogged onto the field and lifted Sarah Tukolsky up out of the dirt. She called out to the umpires, "Can I help her around the bases?" One umpire shouted back, "Why would you want to do that?" That gave Mallory her answer. She half-carried Sarah as she hobbled around the baseline and touched each base. The crowd rose to its feet as Mallory Holtman helped Sarah Tukolsky make her first and only home run. No matter how much we try, we humans always fall short of the law and prophets. In fact, they serve as reminders of our failure to match God's holiness. The law could not save us. The prophets could not save us. God saw our fallen state, and he sent Jesus. He actually came himself in Jesus to lift us up out of the dirt. The experience on the Mount of Transfiguration confirmed for Simon Peter what he already believed about Christ. It was Simon Peter who, in answer to Jesus' question at Caesarea Philippi, "Who do men say that I am?" Jesus asked. And Peter affirmed, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And by his own sacrifice, Jesus carries each of us to home plate. Amen.